Welcome back, and my guest is Professor Barney Pityana. We're talking about the life of Steve Biko, the teachings of Biko, and himself, by the way. He will talk about Steve Biko as if he was separate from the story, but he's as guilty as charged about this black consciousness thing. How would you explain it to somebody else? What are the elements? What is the essence of black consciousness?
I like to start with something that I really want to call imagination idealism. The idea of thinking yourself in a transcendent way beyond your current circumstances. And I say this because I say this today, is that we need to recapture that idealism, that sort of starry-eyed idea of a world that can be made and that it is possible to be made differently by us and nobody else. For me, that's where it begins. From there, it begins to say, if that is the case, then you have an agency. You are an agent for changing these things. As part of it is your responsibility. So that oppression isn't just what the other person does to you. That's the real thing about Steve Biko. He was saying, we allow oppression to actually take hold of us. And until we actually take up the cudgels and bring an end to oppression by fighting it, we become agents of our own liberation. So he was then saying to black people, until you really take up the idea that you are your own liberators, and therefore things like fear and oppression, because at the end of the day, we allow the oppressor to do to us what in fact dehumanizes us. We must put a stop to that.
Well, that is my understanding, Prof. And I've taken a bit of flack for going along with that understanding, that it is not a case of being anti-something only, but it is more of being pro your own dignity, yourself, and extending the same to other people. And even teaching those who may dehumanize you that actually it's not the way to be, because the effort or act of dehumanizing you dehumanizes the very next person. Right. So if it's said by you, then I rest my case, because I agree with you. But you went to the UK anyway and studied for some time there, and I mentioned that you're a lawyer, you are a preacher, and you are an academic. You put all of these things together, and of course a force on your own. Tell me, how do you put all of these things together and the aspiration behind it?
Tim, it was circumstances, a natural progression. When I qualified law, I'd done articles, I'd finished all the law degrees that came with it. And then when it was time to be admitted, the Minister of Justice at that time issued me with an order that kind of named me, those days it was called you get named as a communist. The effect of that was that you were then, you were prevented from practicing as a lawyer. So the effect of that being named a communist by the Minister of Justice meant that my application for admission could not go through, couldn't in fact happen. And then I got a banning order, the effect of which was that I couldn't practice as an attorney, I couldn't set foot in a place of law, etc., etc. The result of that is in fact what got me to leave the country and go into exile. And I hadn't thought about that until that moment. And of course this was a year after Steve Biko was murdered, and there had been lots of people who were saying to me, it's about time you get out of here.
You might be next.
Because you might be next. Yeah. And I really got that message eventually, so we left. And then we left and went to England. And in England, through then Bishop Desmond Tutu, who'd been the Bishop of Lesotho, went to King's College London, his old college, because he had managed to find a scholarship for me to go to King's. So I went to King's College London, read a degree in theology majoring in philosophy and systematic theology, and from there went to Oxford. And then I spent a couple of years both doing postgraduate studies in philosophy at King's College London, and then working as a parish priest in England, and then went to the World Council of Churches. It is in fact through working with the World Council of Churches that I was drawn back to South Africa. And I had been spending all that time being very active in the African National Congress, having begun by trying to rally together the black consciousness forces in exile, and soon recognized that this wasn't going to work. And therefore I made my way into being active in the African National Congress again. And those two things, both my studies, my activism in the anti-apartheid movement, African National Congress, as well as my work with the church, all of those things drew me to the World Council of Churches, which in turn drew me back to South Africa. And that came because Frank Chikane invited me to come back in 1990. And I didn't know, this was shortly after the speech by then President F.W. de Klerk to assist with the Rustenburg conference that took place that time. So it was Frank who invited me back. Once I was back for an extended period of 3 months, then I got different people saying, come back, come back, come back, come back. One of them was I then invited to the University of Cape Town, where in fact I came to teach at UCT. So things kind of came into place in a manner that I hadn't realized.
And then, of course, you got involved with the South African Human Rights Commission and got involved in different activities, as well as leading the UNISA, the university, for almost 10 years or thereabouts, as the Vice Chancellor. But now, and your formative years with Steve Biko, most of the stuff happened within a learning environment. And beyond what you were studying towards, you were learning other things and formulating ideas. When you look at education, the system today, what do you think is going on? Because to my mind, it does not seem that we're producing the kind of outcomes that should meet the challenges of our time.
It's a big challenge, Tim. It's just amazing. Since 1994, it must be said positively that the South African government under successive presidents have put money and resources into education, including higher education, in a manner that is beyond what, in fact, we are getting in return. However, the biggest challenge, partly because we may well have underestimated the extent of the apartheid system that we were inheriting. The biggest challenge has been to really transform basic education from preschool to end of school. And the result of what we get out of that has been one of the most lamentable things, because it lacks depth, because it lacks cognitive understanding that puts people in good stead for post-school training and education, sufficient enough to be able to provide the driving force for our economy and our technology and our science and our society. The second thing that is lacking, has been lacking, are those important things from school level of values. Professor Kara Asmal, who was Minister of Education, made a big effort in instilling values into our schooling system. And I think we miss values. At the moment, we really have a serious problem in terms of what goes on in schools: violence, rape, educators or teachers, a lack of awareness of responsibility on parts of teachers and parents, and homes and school and community. That breakup.
But you see, Prof, that's exactly the point for me, that don't schools and the education system, don't they mirror what's going on in the broader society? And having said that, I'm raising a couple of points. One, we've got the Constitution. Personally, I think the preamble sums it up nicely. That if you familiarize yourself with the preamble of our Constitution, then you can get some direction of what needs to happen in South Africa. But somehow, as individual citizens, we seem to be struggling with a variety of social challenges that you have mentioned, to the extent that I suppose individuals feel that it's too much and they've got no sense of where to go, and thus join churches run by charlatan pastors, for instance. You look at the political system, there seems to be problems there, municipalities, a whole number of things, institutions that people should be looking up to seem to be coming apart.
You know, my very serious view is that the problem we have today has nothing to do with the Constitution, indeed not even with the institutions, it's with the people. And by that I mean there's just too much of people in our country who have no appreciation of themselves. As I often say, you know, we need to understand freedom, what it is to be a free spirit, to be a free being. We seem to have, if you like, brought ourselves into forms of voluntary apartheids of various kinds. And we do not take hold of the opportunities that freedom brings to us.
And we've outsourced our own free will and our own
outsource our freedom
to think. Yeah.
To think, to transform, to be the agents of change to a large degree. So we need to kind of recover. The second thing is that I think we probably don't recognize enough, I think I said something similar, how broken our society and our people are. So what we need is a real movement that reaches out at people at ordinary levels, because if that had been the case, we would never have had a Zuma as president of our country, because there was no way that ordinarily he should ever have been the president of the country. We would not have be having these pastors and pseudo-religions that many ordinary, I'd like to think, thinking people end up outsourcing their lives and their thinking to the extent that they do today. We wouldn't do that. We would be having a much more of a questioning society, a thinking community, a community that, for those of us who come from the freedom struggle, we were in the freedom struggle because we could question what was being dished out to us.
Well, let's engage in some wishful thinking. Two parts to that. If Steve Biko was around now, what do you think his take would be of the state of affairs currently? And the second part, Professor Pityana's view of the future given where we are now. So the first part is about Biko's take on the current situation, and the second part is you casting your eyes ahead.
I think even today, Steve Biko would be urging South Africans to embrace and recognize black consciousness. And because the definition of black consciousness was a much more nuanced than many people tend to understand it. It is that the kind of value. My view is that if SADTU, if the teachers who are members of SADTU, who are predominantly black, if they were black conscious, they would know the responsibility that they have to the African child, to the black child. And they wouldn't be raping them, they wouldn't be doing all the kind of stuff that they are doing to children, because they would be doing it to the black child. And Steve would be saying, you know, it's our responsibility and nobody else's, because black consciousness tells us it's our responsibility to make of this country the best that it could possibly be. So I think Steve Biko would be urging us in a prophetic way to really recognize the place of black consciousness in our society today. I'm talking black consciousness not in organizational terms.
Your view of the future, looking at...
No, we're looking at the future. And I really do believe that, as we used to say in black consciousness, the future is black. By this I mean, until we black people, in particular, recognize our place under the sun, we recognize our responsibility for this nation and its future, and recognize that we are an important component in making of this nation what it should be. That's where the future lies. And so we take government, we make government responsible, we are responsible for the democracy that we have, We recognize the constitution that we have. We are very careful about building this nation into what it can become.
Professor Barney Pityana, thank you very much for coming around and spending time with me and sharing thoughts with us.
Thank you, Tim. This has been wonderful.
And we were reflecting on the influence of Steve Biko, as well as his own views, Professor Barney Pityana, on the situation in South Africa and the future of our nation. After the break, we'll be looking at how we use social media networks and what we can learn from that. So don't go away.